as I said, there will be two parts to the story, the Better Homes of South Bend story of the 1950s, and the question we have to ask ourselves, why is this still important to us today? Does it still matter today? What can we learn from it? And where are we now? In a way, the Better Homes story should have been a very simple story, or better yet, it didn't need to be a story at all, because all this group wanted was to find a nice place to raise their children. But it was not a simple story, and they were fully aware of this. In fact, even long before they started, they talked about their project and what they were trying to accomplish only in whispers, and made always sure that nobody they didn't trust would hear about it. And then when I saw the minutes, there it was again, right in the first minutes, the president urging everyone to not say anything, to keep this a secret. In fact, throughout the minutes, they never mention the location. They call it a nice place for building or a beautiful site, but they never mention the location. So who was this Better Homes group? They were people who came from the South in the second Great Migration during the 1940s. The first one was during the First World War when the immigrant labor dried up. And they wanted, of course, to get away from Jim Crow, and they had also heard that jobs were desperately needed in northern industrial cities, so they thought they could make a good living and have a good life for their families. And they were right, jobs were desperately needed. What they didn't realize was that, as one so memorably put it, we met Jim Crow in the North. Because even though they needed workers, most companies did not hire African Americans. In fact, in South Bend, Studebaker was the only one that did. And they did because they were unionized. The unions at that time were great fighters against discrimination. In fact, there was a popular poster you may have seen, a hand with a big sponge saying, "Wipe away discrimination." So Studebaker hired, but after that, Jim Crow made himself felt again by having African Americans work only under the worst conditions, namely in the foundry, where they had to handle red hot metal and lift heavy loads, and it was dangerous. You can see that it looks scary just even to look at it. And Leroy Cobb, who was going to be the youngest member of that group, told me that when he joined Studebaker in the foundry right out of high school, the older workers there protected him and looked out for him. And he said at one time, they even shouted at the foreman, "Stop the line and take that boy off, he'll get hurt." He was just in the process of lifting that red hot metal with just a hook and throwing it in the hopper, I think kind of like you see it there. And that was just too dangerous. And so these guys looked out for him and did the heavy work, more of the heavy work, to protect him. If we could maybe see the next one too, Sarah. This is the aerial view of the Studebaker factory, and the foundry is right in the front there. And just look at that diagonal street, that's Prairie Avenue, and that's where the Better Homes folks were starting out. Because they met Jim Crow, of course, not only in the factory work, but everywhere. You know, places like the Philadelphia restaurant, the best ice cream place in South Bend, was close to them, as were many restaurants and hotels. And where it hurt the most was in living. Living was strictly segregated. And this was a segregation that went from the federal government to the state to the local. It was a complete grip in a way, because the places they lived in, maybe show us the next slide, were the defense homes, but African Americans lived in the more shoddily built defense homes that were crowded together and were in the worst locations. These ones were right across from the foundry, you know, the Oliver plant not far away, kind of wedged between railroad lines. And when they talked after work or on weekends together, they said they hadn't uprooted themselves from the South to live like this. But they knew that they had huge obstacles in front of them. Many were familiar with Dr. Wagner. In fact, he delivered many of their children. And they knew that when he came in 1948, I think, and wanted to buy a house for himself, his wife, and his 3 children, his wife made calls to banks and realtors. And one bank told her that a wonderful house had just come on the market that seemed to exactly suit what they were interested in. And she said, "Oh yes, let's," and made an appointment. And when they walked in the door, the banker flat out told them the house wasn't available to them. And we all know Dr. Chambly had the same problem. The realtor's office wouldn't even let him see a realtor, and just the receptionist turned him away. So they knew they couldn't do this by themselves, and they needed help. And here they were lucky to find J. Chester Allen. He was a lifelong fighter for social justice. And not only that, but he was used to failures, to setbacks, to refusals. For example, it was J. Chester Allen, when he was the first state rep from South Bend, African American state rep from South Bend, who sponsored a bill that would have made it illegal for companies with defense contracts to hire on a discriminatory basis. But the bill was soundly defeated. And he made this moving statement when more defense homes were being moved into South Bend, and again they were put into a black neighborhood, and in fact they were going to tear down a vital business district. He fought against this, but he saw that he wouldn't succeed, that it wouldn't go anywhere. So he said, he wrote in the paper, "We feel we are making a sacrifice in agreeing to segregation, but we are willing to take it at the present if it will help the war effort." Because he says it is vitally important that the Negro citizen continue his unbroken record of loyalty to America and at the same time militantly insists that he be given his full rights of American citizenship. I think we all recognize the double consciousness that W.E.B. Du Bois talks about in The Souls of Black Folk. So he knew the patience and endurance and courage it took to bring about social change. He was also one who helped to have the natatorium, which was touted as the most beautiful indoor swimming pool in the state, have it open to African Americans. But it took him a full 19 years before that was accomplished. Sarah, can you move to it's such a beautiful building. And now, of course, we all know it as the Civil Rights Heritage Center under the inspiring leadership of Darrell Heller. So I hope it has a good future, trying to make up a bit for its bad past. So finally, on May 21st, 1950, they were ready to take the first step to form a corporation, because again, Chester Allen said, even if I would help you individually, we wouldn't get anywhere. We need to organize, we need to get together. And so if you can show us the first page of the, the first page of the minutes. There they are. Sorry, I must have got them. I don't know whether you can read it, but it says, the very first sentence says, a non-profit organization was formed and given the name of Better Homes of South Bend. I don't know whether it's me, but I just feel that mountain of anxiety and hope and fear that lies behind these very simple, almost laconic words in the passive voice. They knew that what they were setting out to do or to attempt to do was really just a huge, huge enterprise. And success was by no means guaranteed. But here again, they were lucky in getting the help of D. Hart Hubbard. He was an African American FHA advisor in Cleveland. I assume that Chichester Allen made the contact because he often was in Cleveland, but I could not confirm this. Whenever Leroy Cobb mentioned Hubbard, his face just lit up because that man says changed his life. He modeled himself after him ever after, and he attributes much of his success in his career to Hubbard's example. And everybody was impressed when this well-dressed, handsome 47-year-old man stepped into their meeting and said he would help them. And of course, they all had heard of his illustrious background. He was the very first African American to win Olympic gold in a single event. And that was in Paris, no less, in 1924. And he was one of the very few people to graduate from the African Americans to graduate from the University of Michigan in 1927. So he had all these successes behind him, and he had an air of confidence and authority, and he promised them that they would succeed. Actually, at the time, I was reading Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, and he does not mention African American advisors to the FHA. He talks a lot about, what the FHA did and how it helped further segregation. So I sent him an email and asked him, and he wrote me right back and said, yes, he had heard of this and he knew about it, but he hadn't discussed it in his book, and he wanted to know more information. And we had quite an exchange, and he thought that D. Hart Hubbard must have been one of the very first. There weren't that many, but under pressure, again, often from unions, the FHA agreed in the 50s to employ some African American advisors to help them, and D. Hart Hubbard happened to be one of those. So they were very lucky because the banks were the biggest obstacle they faced. Banks just did not give mortgages, loans to African Americans. And they did not see that they would succeed unless they had this outside help. So they made very many, a delegation was sent to different banks, and D. Hart Hubbard occasionally was there with them and helped them. But there were other obstacles. The builders wouldn't build to code. It was quite normal from them to build more shoddily for African Americans. And in the case of Better Homes, they refused to put doors on their closets. They kept changing their prices and they kept changing their schedules. And when you follow the minutes, you see how many trips delegations made to various builders. And this is after work, after their backbreaking work at Studebaker, to talk with them, to negotiate. And they seemed to have something settled. And then it was all, thrown up again, and they had to start over again. And the city was also an obstacle. I never was fully able to determine whether they were dragging their feet or whether it was in part that they were overburdened at the time with sewers and that they couldn't install sewers, because it took almost 2 years to get sewers installed, and before that happened, they couldn't start building. But through all this, the Better Homes group never gave up. And I attribute this very much to their excellent organization. From the very first moment, you see it here on that first page, they had a president, a vice president, a secretary, and a treasurer, and all the functions, and they even had a board of directors. And one of the main jobs of the board of directors was to keep the group together and to collect the money they had to pay, because for cash flow, they had occasionally to make payments for things. And so they had to come up with the money, but they didn't see any homes built, and they almost sometimes despaired of making progress. So it was a hard job, but they did it very well. And all of this was, a huge effort. If you think of, we'll talk later on how hard these people worked to keep all this going. But Hubbard encouraged them, and he says, you guys will go down in history as the first corporation to sponsor such a successful adventure. And they did. In 1954, they could finally celebrate with a picnic. And I think this shows this group, the Better Homes group, not merely as victims of discrimination and segregation and white oppression, which of course they were, but also as courageous and resourceful actors in their own right, that they succeeded in this. And this is the picnic celebration. Leroy would describe that everybody couldn't stop grinning because from him, he was 24 at the time, to the oldest member who was in his 70s, they had never dreamt that they would be able to own their own home. And so they just could not believe their fortune. And afterwards, he said, we would spend still years sitting and around our barbecues on weekends and talking about would we ever have thought this was possible, and being just delighted that it happened. They built 22 homes in a white neighborhood. This was the 17 and 1800 block of North Elmer Street. At that time, up to the 1600 block, it was pretty fully developed and occupied, but all with white folks, largely immigrants from Hungary, from Poland, from Germany. From the 1700 block on, it was still all white, but much, much more sparsely populated. But so they really formed an island in this white world. And what surprised me, although it shouldn't have, was that they not only managed to build these 22 homes, which was just unimaginable that they did this, but that they built such a vibrant community there, because they had forged this kind of connection through these years of struggle, and they really were like a family. Michael Jackson, who I think is here with us, once put it so well when he said, on Elmer Street, I had many dads. And so often when I talked to Leroy Cobb and he would talk about one of the children, by now most of them were already retired, he always would say, oh, he is like a son to me, or she is like a daughter to me. They were really one big family. And they celebrated also parades. Maybe we can see some of the next pictures. Yeah, here, the Baton Town. In the background is the Elmer Street, and those of you who might know the area, it still looks very much like that. They would have 4th of July parades, and here are the kids all dressed up practicing for this. And when I was lucky to have some meetings with the children of Better Homes, the first one organized by Leroy Cobb, and you could just sense, although this togetherness, they still, although they didn't see each other necessarily every day or so, they still felt like family. And this all translated into an incredible success for the next generation. 50% of the children of Better Homes attended college. This is far above the average. And they became teachers and school principals and an attorney, a professor, and even the ones who only finished high school had very successful and stable careers and became valuable members of their community. And I think 2 things they absorbed from their parents. The first, they just observed by example, and that was hard work. The parents worked incredibly hard. Leroy Cobb and many of the others would get up real early in the morning to clean offices before going to Studebaker. And then he would clean more offices after he had finished at Studebaker and come home late at night and then start the same thing again the next day. But he wanted to save money, to build a good, solid future for his children. The other things they learned was something the parents told them, that education was vital. They needed to get an education. One of them told me that her mother, or was it her grandmother, always told her, you need to get an education. Go get an education. It's the only thing the white man can take away from you. So with these foundations, they had this tremendous success. I think this may be a point where we could have our first discussion or conversation. Sarah, if you can, great. I know I will want this to be a conversation rather than a Q&A with me just talking again, because you've heard me just now. And there are so many people here who know a lot more than I do on this. So please give us your comments, your questions, your something you want to add to this. Have we got something in the chat, Sarah?
No questions in the chat, although someone did mention that she was looking forward to the stage play.
Oh, yes, yes. A wonderful playwright is going to, from DC, is going to write the play. At the last time I heard, she is still on time, and despite COVID, she is still on track. I think 2022 is the scheduled world premiere, I guess. Any questions or?
We got one. Linda asked, did any of the families know each other before coming to South Bend?
No. They got to know each other. Most of them lived in those defense homes you saw, so they were very close together. And a few others lived in other areas, but also near the factory. And they got to know each other then. And, they talked for really a couple of years before they even ventured out to look for some outside help. So they got to know each other pretty well. Any other comments? Or?
And you can also unmute yourself if it's easier, sometimes than typing. Here's another question. Can you talk a bit about the historical designation and how that came about?
Oh, the better homes. That was my last slide, but yeah, why don't we leave it? That's my last slide. I was very happy to get that for better homes, because believe it or not, it is the very first state historic marker commemorating African American history. And now we have another one. We got one for J. Chester and Elizabeth Allen, and it was supposed to be unveiled, when was it, last summer? But with COVID, we had to postpone it because there were a number of people coming from out of town, and travel just was too difficult. And we are now shooting for maybe late summer of this year. And the advantage of this one will be that it's right downtown. It will be in front of the Lafayette building, if you know, that's right across from the County City building. And that's where the Allens had their office for over 30 years. So that will be the first African-American landmark right in the center of town.
That's great. We got another question. Were the African-American workers paid the same as the white workers?
Yes, that was again the union job. And it was very good. They were well paid. Studebaker paid really well. That was the advantage. The disadvantage was that they just had the worst jobs.
Another question. How did you end up learning about this story and decide to write about it? And she just also mentioned that she appreciated that you said this should have been a non-story, just someone.
Yes, it really should have. I was introduced to Leroy Cobb, who really wanted the story told. And I was on a whole different writing project at the time, and I hadn't really thought that way, but he persuaded me. Just talking to him and feeling his urgency, and then hearing more about the story, I thought this is really a story that needs to be told. Because I'm not sure, many people, I think, in the African American community knew something about it. But even the children said at times the parents protected them and so didn't tell them all the hardship that they went through to get where they were. So it should be on the record as part of the history. It's really part of the history of any northern industrial town.
We got several more questions here. Was there any positive interaction with the nearby neighbors who were immigrants from Europe?
Not really. Is Michael Jackson there?
I don't think
I don't see him. I would have thrown this to him. And I did not touch, this is a whole area I didn't touch upon here because of time constraints, but the school, Marquette School, before classes started in the fall, had to have a special training for the teachers because these kids were the first African American kids in that school. And there were always only one or two in each class, or sometimes only one. So it wasn't easy to be the only African American in class. On the whole, from what I gathered, the girls had a pretty good, they adapted very easily. Brenda Wright would tell me that she went to all the white girls' birthday parties and, had a really good time. The boys had a bit of a harder time. Some of them, although very few reported any major problems, although there was one big incident where some, some newspaper money or so had been stolen, and they immediately interviewed the black boys. And one of them said he'd never forgotten that he was called into the principal's office without, his parents, his mother then eventually joined, and, the suspicion immediately fell on them. But on the whole, it wasn't bad. The only thing that, again, I think it's Michael Jackson would say, that still hurt him, they were avid baseball players. And the Little League was supposed to, start in the summer, and they were part of one of the Little League areas. But when Little League realized that this was a black area, they moved their borders one further down below Huey, if there's Olive, Elmer, Huey, and below that, so they couldn't participate. And he says that really hurt because they so wanted to do that. Instead, they had to do pickup games and parks and so on, but they couldn't play in the Little League proper.
Another question that you may have answered, do you know what schools they attended back then? I think you mentioned some of those.
Yeah, Marquette Elementary and LaSalle, and some eventually went to the downtown one. I can't think of the name right now. What's the downtown?
Central.
Help me out. Central, yes. And the ones who went to Central really liked it.
Could you talk more about the social conditions at the time? Where did Black folks go for entertainment and leisure?
The biggest attraction, and this would be clearly, I'm throwing out a hint here, another historic marker is Herring House. Are you familiar with Herring House? It's no longer standing. It's kind of across from the Kroc Center, roughly, where the Kroc Center is now, on the other side of the street. And it was really, Monica can talk about that too. I just see you there, Monica. It was the one place African Americans could gather to have meetings, to have parties. The kids would have Christmas parties there, and people just remember it so fondly as the one place because there wasn't really anything before then. It was a Notre Dame coach, I think, who it was a church that they made into a community center. And Better Homes would have some of their meetings there as well.
Ken Smith made a comment that it seems from this history that part of any community's hope is building the skills of group and personal activism. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and in fact, I think this sort of community engagement and movement project that Better Homes was involved in not only helped them, but also taught them. It taught them how to deal with banks, how to deal with the city, when to know when they needed outside help, because J. Chester Allen wasn't their only attorney. When they dealt with the city, they had George Sands, who sort of specialized in dealing with sewer installations and all the different steps and helping people through. So they learned when they had to, whom they had to contact, so that in their future life, when Leroy Cobb would buy houses and invest in housing, but he knew whom in the city to contact, how to deal with them. So they learned a huge amount from this civic engagement that they were involved in. Ken, does that answer your question, or were you going to say something else? It's funny looking. I don't see you, but and there's that book by Jessica Gordon Nemhart called Collective Courage that talks about all the things people learn from this. And they learn really, even later on, to have civic and political engagements through this kind of community interaction and working together.
Some more questions.
Nobody else was alive anymore. Oh, no, a couple of people were alive, but they were in homes and they couldn't, I couldn't contact them. So Leroy is the only one who would tell me how much he learned from that, but I bet the others did as well.
How many homes were there total, Gabrielle?
22. There were originally 26 planned, but 4 people just gave up. They just thought it would never happen. And one of them moved to Chicago and others just gave up. But most of them stuck with it. And that is in part, again, their organization, the Hubbard's confidence and the faith they had in him, the help of J. Chester Allen and all these other attorneys. Nathan Levy also helped, who helped them, and their own really proactive and well-organized way of handling things over the 4 years.
And how many of those homes are still standing?
I can't give you a number of that, but quite a number are still standing. Some have been enlarged, so they look different now. And I'm not, the one that has been definitely turned demolished is Leroy Cobb's house, and the marker is standing right in front of that. And what happened there was, after 37 years, Leroy and his family, he had a large family, they moved out and they sold the house, and the people who bought it then in turn, after a few years, wanted to sell it and couldn't find a buyer, so they just left it. And the neighbors kept calling and calling code enforcement and the city and say something needs to be done, but nothing was. So it eventually just was a ruin. In the book, I have a picture of what it looked like. It could not be salvaged at that point. And I went to a meeting once of the Far Northwest Neighborhood Association, and an old lady came up. Leroy and I were sitting there, and he came to Leroy and she said, "It's such a shame. That was the most beautiful house on the block, because he kept the lawn. It was a corner lot and he kept the lawn perfect and had a garden, and it was just a lovely place." And Leroy, who is not an angry or bitter man, despite all this that he had gone through in his life, it did make him angry that they tore that house down. It's actually the only time that I've seen him really angry about, how he was treated.
Just a couple more questions that have been.
Yeah, we should probably move on then.
Yeah. Do you want to save these for the end?
Maybe so.
Okay. One quick one. Just do you know if Oliver Plow Works employed African Americans?
No, they did not. As far as I know, at that time, late 40s, 1950, George, would you be able to give more information? As far as I know, Studebaker was really the only one that did, and only because of the union.
Yeah, and it's going to depend on when, and I don't know the details on Oliver.
Singer, I think it was the 60s.
Yeah, Singer Sewing Machine was another huge employer, but unquestionably Studebaker was the largest industrial employer.
Yeah.
But of course, other jobs too, like janitorial and other things.
I seem to remember they had a janitor in Oliver, maybe in the early 60s or so. But
I see Monica has her hand raised.
Monica, yes.
This is a great presentation, Gabrielle. And I was just rereading The Negro in South Bend by Reverend Buford Gordon.
Oh, isn't that a great book? Yeah.
It is. It's a social survey of African American life in the early 1920s. He was following in the footsteps of W.E.B. Du Bois and the Philadelphia Negro. And he does report that, Oliver did not hire African Americans in the World War I Great Migration era,
right.
and except in the role of janitor.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about World War II, but that source does state that.
Thank you, Monica, and that is my understanding as well, that they didn't. And the Buford book actually was the one that got that coach to make Herring House available, because Buford keeps stressing that there's no place for the kids to go and congregate, or for people to have parties or gatherings and so on, that there's just nothing in South Bend. And based on that, they decided that something needed to be created.
The story that I heard about Oliver, and I don't know how apocryphal this is, but the story was they tried or had hired one person. That person obviously crushed under the weight of the racism, but that they experienced, but that wasn't a good fit. And then that sparked managers to say, well, we tried one person and it didn't work, so we're not going to try again.
May well be true. I have no idea.
Okay, that was not a good question. I thought.
Lots more opportunities for research and for IUSB students to get involved and figure some of these things out, to work on that. That would be nice. This was the most vibrant business district. Charlotte, wasn't it you who always said you wanted to live in that area when you came from Niles to South Bend?
Yes, and I did.
And it was beautiful, and now there's nothing.
I raised my children in this area.
Yeah. That's Pilgrim Church there, and St. John's is off to the left here, and the Catholic Church would be, in front there. But it was a vibrant business. It had a hotel. There was a Liston Hotel. And all kinds of amenities and stores and living, and now there's nothing. The question is, why is it still important today? What can we learn? And I was just going to bring up 3 points. Better Homes shows us what it takes to bring about social change. Feel free to add more, but these are the ones that I think are really quite important. I was reminded of what W.E.B. Du Bois again said in 1933, when he called on African Americans to, quote, give the world an example of intelligent cooperation. because if they would not, they said, we would again be left behind as mere beggars. And it seemed to always, in my mind, as soon as I got involved and heard more about the Better Homes venture, that this was a perfect example of intelligent cooperation. All their decisions were voted on. Every voice was heard. There was always mutual support. They were strategic and knew when to seek help. They worked patiently with banks and the city and always learned from each setback and each failure. And they had endurance and patience and courage. I once talked to one of my great mentors and helpers, Charlotte Pfeiffer, who was 12 years on the council, and asked her, what does it take to bring about this social change? And she takes, first of all, it takes responsibility. You have to take responsibility to want to do something on your own or in a group. Then you have to speak with one voice. You have to stay united. And third, you have to be organized. And again, like with Du Bois, this is intelligent cooperation, and Better Homes embodied that perfectly. The second point, the crucial importance of fair housing for the success of future generations. We talked about how well the children of Better Homes did, all of them, not just the college-educated ones. And there was a study in 2015 done by Harvard, this is an academic study that proved something that Better Homes showed in reality. What it proved was that children who were moved to better areas to live in better communities were, quote, significantly more likely to attend college. And that's exactly what we saw in 1950 in Better Homes. But home ownership has another, and this community has another great advantage, and that is that it is the chief and often the only way for the middle class to accumulate wealth that can be passed on to the children. The increasing value of the house and then selling the house and moving to another one, that helps build a foundation of wealth that African Americans were just cheated out of for a long, long time. But point 3 is the one I want to dwell on for the rest of in most detail. Incredibly, it's over 50 years after the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and nationwide, redlining and housing discrimination persist. If we could show the next slide, Sarah. No, the one, this one, yes. The one of the New York Times. Yeah. You can read it there. This was in 2015, and it showed what a pitifully small number of African Americans got bank loans in 2014 in, I think it was in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. 25 out of 1,886. And this is, again, the result of redlining. Redlining meaning setting apart areas which are likely to suffer foreclosure, so banks wouldn't loan money and the FHA wouldn't underwrite it. And the FHA, we really need to say a bit more about that. The FHA was founded with the mission of helping middle-class people who didn't have much, didn't have a down payment and didn't have much cash, help them to own their own homes. And the drive behind it, I think, and it probably wasn't the only one, but one main reason that they did this was because they saw it as a good weapon in the battle against communism. They thought if people own their own homes, they wouldn't become communists. They wouldn't sympathize with communists because they wouldn't want to lose their own property. But this all did not include African Americans, because the FHA, the official manual of the FHA, now it was adjusted after 1950 in wording, but not in spirit. That was that they wanted to create what they called racially pure neighborhoods. They would often use the kind of embellishing phrase harmonious neighborhoods, but that was meant neighborhoods without minorities. And they said, and this is a quote, protective covenants are essential for the sound development of harmonious neighborhoods. Protective covenants which kept out minorities. So if the FHA wouldn't underwrite the loans, the banks wouldn't give them, they wouldn't take the risk. So the African Americans have been excluded from home ownership and its appreciation for decades and decades. And this creates the ever widening gap in prosperity, the racial wealth gap that is growing exponentially. So what should our response be as a nation? Richard Rothstein thinks, first of all, we have to accept responsibility. We have to face the facts. He says the public power of yesterday still shape the racial landscape of today, because he shows the systematic violation of African Americans' constitutional rights through aggressive enforcement of racially discriminatory policies and actions. I had that one too, just to see the systematic violation of constitutional rights through aggressive enforcement of discriminatory policies. And these were aggressively enforced because they were enforced from the federal government on up. The redlining actually was created under President Roosevelt, and it was just maintained through the decades. So Rothstein thinks we first of all have to face these facts, and his book, The Color of Law, lays out in great detail what the FHA, the Realtors Association, the federal government, how they prevented African Americans from owning their own homes. So we need to fully acknowledge the guilt and the responsibility that we have. And then at the end of the book, he sort of swings to something different a little, because he says change needs to happen from the ground up, from the beginning. And he means the kids, because he read the most popular school textbooks in the United States, across the country. And he found hardly any reference of the reality of what had been going on. Occasionally there would be one vague sentence, African Americans lived apart or something, but nothing essentially. And it was aggressive because it was, as he calls it, a de jure discrimination, a discrimination through the law. And we need to educate our children to the realities of it so that they grow up knowing what is really going on. Another solution, of course, is the famous Ta-Nehisi Coates article in The Atlantic called A Case for Reparations, where he shows how African Americans were cheated out of millions upon millions of dollars, and says we need to have reparations. And he means financial reparations, but he also means moral reparations. A national reckoning is what he's calling for. It's the only way to spiritual renewal. And he cites the example of Germany. And as a German, I know from my own painful experience that we all need to acknowledge our past. In fact, I just wrote a memoir about it, and that in turn, I got the courage to do from a book, an American book, Edward Ball's Slaves in the Family, where he was going to write about the slaves his family kept, but got huge opposition from his family. And at first it kind of made him stop, but then he decided, no, he was not responsible for what his family did in keeping slaves and how they treated them, but he was accountable. We are all accountable for our pasts, and that finally got me up the courage to face my own past. Because when I grew up in the 1950s in Germany, there was complete silence about the Nazi era. It was as if it had never happened. Nobody talked about it. Our history classes ended with the end of World War I. It took over a decade before Germans finally realized they needed to confront their past. They needed to accept the responsibility and the guilt. And I think it helped them to move forward. There's one example that I think is maybe in some form could be used here too. It's called die Stolpersteine in German, which means the stumbling stones. These are little round bronze medals or so that are set into the pavement in front of houses where Jewish citizens, Germans really, had been taken away and sent to concentration camps. And they call them stumbling stones because they want you to stumble over them as you walk past, to think, to be kind of brought up short, and just rethink again, even if just fleetingly, what happened there. So we all need Stolpersteine to remember that, I think, rather than sculptures of Lee and so on. And then most recently, following up on Ta-Nehisi Coates in a way, there is Darity and Mullen's book called From Here to Equality, which makes a much more detailed call for reparations. One thing they first do, and I did not know that since the 19th century, there had been calls for reparations, and there had actually been several very popular groups fighting for this, but of course nothing ever happened with any of them. And I also didn't know that for over 30 years, every year there is a proposal in Congress to study reparations. And it's reintroduced every year, and it's now kept alive by Representative Sheila Jackson Lee and Senator Cory Booker. I didn't realize any of these, but none of them have ever really, been acted upon in any way.
Monica also mentioned in the chat that there's a group seeking reparations for African Americans here in South Bend. So she put her.
Oh, good. Yeah, Monica, I would like to hear more about it. Let me just finish this quickly, but I think that's very interesting. The quote from Here to Equality: the racial wealth gap, the most robust indicator of cumulative economic effects of white supremacy in the United States. And the only way to address that is through reparations, and reparations that need to be wide-ranging. Yes, financial reparations, but also public service, education, all the other things that African Americans have been deprived of for all too long. They even put a price tag to their various proposals. One is over $7 trillion and another one over $10 trillion. But it's important that these are wide-ranging to address inequality at all levels. In my most optimistic moments, I think that maybe we have reached a seismic shift in this country, that we are ready for this. With Black Lives Matter, the massive demonstration and so on, I think we are at a different point of awareness, and we are feeling more urgently the need to address what is really the main problem America has. Or it's not just problem, it's blight, it's stain that needs to be addressed. And I think a reckoning is necessary to move forward as a civilized nation. And this is not only important for African Americans, but for all of us. We cannot have a healthy society with such inequalities and such divisions. They create a divide that keeps us from embracing our common humanity and treat each other with compassion and with tolerance. I think COVID has shown us too that we cannot be healthy as a society unless we all have equal access to health. And this goes for all areas in our lives. And now to end, I come to this happier moment. This is the unveiling of the Better Homes marker in front of Leroy's house. And sort of right behind me there is Michael Jackson. Of course, Mayor Pete is there, and Regina. And I look very much forward to having the one downtown, and I hope many of you will show up to celebrate that. Thank you very much, and I hope we'll have time for just a bit of a discussion now.
Yeah, one question from before was how much did this sort of organizing happen in other cities? So how unique was this?
It was, I think it was from my research, it was the first such thing in Indiana. I know the first building co-op in Chicago didn't happen till the 1960s, but I wanted to put that on the marker, but you know, the marker people rightfully say there could be one that we don't know about, and you know, they don't want something wrong. Somebody's always going to point that out, and then the whole thing has to be redone and so on. It's certainly one of the earliest.
And where is the marker located at? Could you give like an address? Or?
It's the 1700 North Elmer Street. And I'm really glad it is there, and it's there for people to see, and it's there for that whole neighborhood to be proud of its history. That is all good. But I also would like that other one to be downtown, so to be, you know, easily visible to a lot of people. Here you have to make a concerted effort to go there. But with that, you know, you'll just see it walking past or driving past. Monica, what about the reparations group?
Yes, thanks for letting me make this announcement. And if Daryl Heller is able to chime in, I'd be happy for him to also say something. We've been meeting since 2019 when Dr. Heller gave a speech at the Civil Rights Heritage Center about reparations, and Regina Preston Williams was also important in organizing some discussion after that. And we've been meeting at 3 areas here locally: housing, health, and also small business. So we're looking at the past and how to honor that, and also how to come up with some monetary reparations here in South Bend. So I could say more, but just go ahead and contact me if you have questions.
Yes, I will. Is that the same group NIMBY is part of?
Yes, NIMBY.
Okay, then I do know about that a bit more.
She's wonderful and has written a book herself.
Oh yes, a lovely, lovely book.
And Gabrielle, this is Daryl. Just the one other thing about the reparations group is that we're doing exactly what you said needs to happen. One of the things we've talked a lot about is the need to do the reckoning, to really come to terms with the past, and to not only understand it, but to ensure that it's part of the narrative that we have about the history of South Bend, that it's not peripheral, it's not just about Black people or depriving. But one of the things I think about and talk about is we celebrate, you know, the perseverance of, you know, the Better Homes folks against adversity, but we very seldom talk about what produced the adversity in the first place. And that needs to be part of the reckoning and the conversation as we move forward.
I think that's so right. I really do not think we can move forward as a nation without that. I mean, it's in a way incredible that we've had this for centuries and acted as if it didn't exist, or as if, you know, oh, we have the Fair Housing Act, everything's okay now, you know. or even worse, the new Jim Crow. If we can't have Jim Crow the way it used to be, we now create it through the penal code, make
Yeah.
it legal through the penal code, instead of really reckoning. Yeah.
And if I can just say one more thing, I don't actually know all the facts in this, but Aladdin DeRose has done more research on housing in South Bend, and I think
Who's
has
that?
Aladdin DeRose.
Okay.
She's an attorney, and she's part of our reparations group. And she's done more research on housing here in South Bend and has done a comparison. And I don't know the details, but I would be interested to have her share more of it. That even despite the capacity of people to build better homes in South Bend and for African Americans to own their own homes, when we look at the market today, the value of African American homes are still so much lower than the value of white-owned homes. And so while there is an ability on some level to pass on generational wealth, there's still a true disparity because of how property values are determined and how African American communities are still assessed for their home values. That creates a disparity that we still have to reckon with, that continues to exist.
Absolutely. And I think, Gladys has been fighting this for a long time too. There is somebody there in her office too who is working with African Americans. It's absolutely true. I'm glad. I would like to talk to Aladdin sometime and learn from her.
That was perfect, because there was a question in the chat wondering if there is still housing discrimination in certain neighborhoods in our area today. So
yes,
yeah.
Right, we can all nod our heads to that. And I have a confession to make. Before I wrote Better Homes, I had never been on the west side of the lake. That was just, we have these fairly narrow tracks that we use even in our city. We don't live in the whole city. We live in certain parts and we go certain ways. And the west side or the lake area just was not part of my itinerary until I wrote Better Homes. And I'm so glad it expanded. I made a lot of friends there, and it's really enriched my life. But without Better Homes, I would never have gone there at all. And the housing is still a problem there. The trash removal is a problem. The houses that are falling apart and where people just don't have the money to redo them. There's so many problems there still. Yes, we are not at all, say, oh, this is now something of the past. That's, I think, really the reason that Better Homes is important. It's not in the past, and it shows us that we need to do something now. I see there's a lot of other things in the chat.
There's a lot of good comments. One question from a little earlier was wondering about the role of the church in this community and these families. Was there a church in this neighborhood?
Many people belong to either, I think the majority belong to either Pilgrim or St. John's, which is now Greater St. John's. It used to be closer to Liston at the time, the original John's Church. Those were the two churches most members of Better Homes belonged to. And also, speaking of being that black island among all the whites, the kids would say, now as grown-ups, that when they went to church was the only time that they were in a larger African American community. Otherwise, they were always just among themselves. I lost the chat. Anything else? I know there are so many people with a lot of knowledge here. As I say, way more. And this is not I'm an English professor, And I just, you know, looked at this particular case, but there's a lot of experts here.
And you can unmute yourself and ask. I think that was all the questions in the chat. So if you have, you don't.
Yeah, Charlotte mentioned the YouTube. I've seen that too, the YouTube interview between Ta-Nehisi Coates and Richard Rothstein. What was amazing about Rothstein, here out of the blue, he had never heard of me. I sent him an email and I got an email back the next day, and then we had an exchange, and I don't know whether he sent, no, I had his book already, but he asked for my book. I sent him my book, and you know, the guy must be so busy to do that. I was very impressed. That is Calabria. I have my own copy too.
Yes, definitely you can get it from the library, and I know there's an ebook because I read the ebook, so.
Yeah, I mean, and other books to read in that way clearly are the New Jim Crow, the Michelle Alexander, and the Isabel Wilkerson cast. Another one who uses a German example, but in this case, that the Nazis modeled much of their racial policies on American racial policies. And they said America managed to do all this and yet always seemed to be the good guy. How did they possibly do that? They couldn't quite understand how that worked.
Karen mentioned that the Better Homes book is available at the Studebaker Museum also to purchase.
It is, yes, because it of course mentions Studebaker. And I would think, well, it's, you know, Amazon and Barnes and Noble and bookshop.org, they all have it. Any other?
I hope people read Caste.
Yes.
Caste really is different than, and I've read all the, it's really different. I think Caste might help Americans get to the real core of our problem. You know, everything else kind of dances around it. And even if we get to pay even if we did reparations, let's say miraculously, one of the major issues is that Black people are not seen as humans, as full humans. And everyone in this country is infected and affected by that issue. That's really it. And if you're Black, and the same can be said of other historically oppressed groups. Right now we're talking about Black. If you're a Black person and you're around, you can feel it in your gut. You can feel it. And what you feel is the lack of recognition of your humanity. And if you don't see someone as a human, then that can, on all kinds of levels, justify how you treat people, what you allow to happen, how things repeat. And I really think that she hit on something that I haven't seen in any other book, and that really might help Americans, that we have a caste system and that Black Americans are permanently in that caste system. And it affects all of our legislation, all of our relationships, everything. Mm-hmm. So I really hope that people read that.
I agree. That, boy, this was powerfully put, Charlotte. Yes.
And that's part of the reason that Black people don't participate. If you'll notice how many Black people are on this in this group. As part of the reason that Black people don't participate and are silent, because what is seldom gotten to is that lack of humanity. And we really don't, and there's so much at stake built upon that lack of humanity. See, people have everyone has a piece in that. It's not just white privilege, it's the whole United States, the success and everything about the United States is built and is upon the lack of humanity of Black people. That's really it. And how to get to that. But anyway, just
Charlotte, how do you think though, you know, when you say it's a very big book and many people who really need to read it would never read it, how could one make this more popularly available, these ideas?
Well, I really think that would be a good idea for different maybe groups to have a book club. And by the way, don't invite your favorite Black person to the group, please. You know, I mean, that's what always happens. No, I don't want to explain it to you. You read it. You talk about it. You explain it. You have that conversation amongst each other, because actually it's safer. It'll be a richer, more productive conversation for white people to have this discussion with them amongst themselves. And I think that's another thing that we always do. We always want to bring in your Black friend or your whatever. It changes the dynamics. You know, I've been around for a long time. A lot of this, and I'm bragging, so don't feel sorry for me. I mean this sincerely, that after years of being around and experiencing, you can come to that. But anyway, I really think that she hit on something so profound. I've never read it or seen it touched in anything else. And I really want to encourage people to read that book. And maybe, well, you know, Gabrielle, you're the English teacher. So maybe everyone could take a chapter and discuss it, you know? But anyway, I don't want to go on it. But
I think it's right. You are putting out this challenge to all of us.
That's what we have to come to. I mean, even our election, we don't want to do away with the Electoral College. And it's based on Black people being 3/5 of a human being. And we don't want to get rid of it. And I don't think we are. So, I mean, it permeates every aspect of American life. I'm going to stop talking. But
No,
I mean,
thank you, Charlotte.
That's enough.
You see why she is my mentor. Any other?
Yeah, Gabrielle, this is Kathy Schuth. I'm really appreciative of your writings and your presentation tonight. I was struck in your book. I had not ever considered the effects of the poor effects on our neighborhoods that happened in kind of when redlining sort of ended and desegregation, and how when African American communities began to disperse more, that we lost important, you know, kind of like economic areas and business districts, and I was wondering if that's something that we could talk a little bit about tonight. It was not something I had really considered as part of, you know, South Bend's history and why we see like Linden Avenue in its current state.
Yes, but Kathy, for those of you who don't know, is very knowledgeable in this area. She is is it executive director? I'm not sure about your title, of the Near Northwest Neighborhood Association. And she's really done a lot to move that neighborhood forward and trying to incorporate all aspects of that neighborhood, which is an ongoing struggle, isn't it, Kathy? But so she knows a lot about that. Yeah, I mean, there were several really vibrant neighborhoods, but that Birds Street, Charlotte, you were the first to talk to me about that before I ever even had gone there, how beautiful it was and how lovely it was to stroll about and see all the people out and, go to ice cream parlors and stores and so on in that area. And Linden School, of course, was there as well. And now there's hardly anything left. There's the Martin Luther King Jr. Club still there, but there isn't really much, that much development hasn't happened there. Right, Charlotte? And when they wanted to build the defense homes, the ones, they wanted to set it right there and get rid of some of those businesses and all, and just plump those defense homes down there. Allen managed to avoid that, and then they put it on. That's when they were moved to the lake, where they now are only visible as the hill. That's the rubble of the defense homes. But, they, without any, or maybe even deliberate, I don't know, they were going to destroy that vibrant area.
It's another reminder to me of how just removing barriers isn't enough. Like, I really appreciate these calls for reparation. That, sometimes if you remove the barrier and more destruction actually occurs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, Rothstein saying that the situation is still ongoing. That's that, the laws and so on that were created are still with us and are still, enforced to a certain degree. I know we have gone over time quite a bit, and I don't want to keep you all. Oh, I see Marianne Moran is here too. I hope you have seen her Tea at 5, by the way. She is just an amazing actor. And did anybody get a chance to catch her on the live stream? It was a wonderful performance. Sorry for the aside. Anything else? But yeah, Monica, I'd like to be in touch with you or Daryl or anyone about that, what you are doing in that group. It will be interesting to see how it will resonate in the community, the idea.
Thank you.
Okay.
Staying around. Yeah, great discussion. And I did record this, and we'll post it on YouTube. I'll put a link in the Facebook event in case people saw this event there. If you are not on Facebook, or if you want to just drop your email in a message to me in the chat, I'll send it directly to your email if you'd like also. Thank you all for joining us and for discussing.
Thank you. It's so good to see you guys. It's so good to see you. Thank you very, very much for your attention to this. And
especially thank you to Gabrielle for talking.
And, these are all important issues that we do have to need to deal with. We do have to. We can't put it off any longer.